I never thought of being complicated with complicated needs. Peace, privacy, a house to live in, where someone doesn't tell me what color my mailbox has to be or how tall my grass may grow. That is why 7 years ago, I purchased 3 acres of land right outside the edge of Pinewood County. It was not fancy, just a plain house with some land to plant a garden and ample room from neighbors so that I would be absolutely unrestricted. What was so special about the property was the private road access that it had. Almost a quarter-mile long, it wound its way through open meadows and tall pines before it reached my driveway. According to the deed, I owned that road alone and was responsible for keeping it in repair. Every spring, I would lay down new gravel. I shoveled it in myself every winter. It was backbreaking work, but it was ours. The rest of the area around us had been largely undeveloped for years. My closest neighbor, Gerald, lived about half a mile to the east. We would nod to each other when we drove past, but otherwise kept to ourselves. That was fine by us. No drama, no politics, no committees. Telling you that your seasonal arrangements were community values, I had in fact chosen this neighborhood. Following a nightmare experience with a domineering homeowners association in my previous neighborhood. They had penalized me for having vegetables in my front yard, cited me for a bird feeder that was not aesthetically in concert with community values, and ultimately pushed me away with their incessant watching and silly regulations. Never again, I had pledged. My peaceful life ran unbroken until about 8 months ago. That was when the surveyors arrived. They showed up one morning along the southern edge of my land, marking stakes and taking measurements. It did not strike me at the time. Land was sold back and forth from time to time. People had a right to develop on their lands. 2 weeks went by before the first bulldozers arrived. A massive chunk of land along the back edge of my property was heading down. Trees fell over to the ground, shook. The silence was now filled with the constant roar of big machinery. Signs were erected, hawking the impending view of Pinewood Estates, high living in the embrace of nature. The hypocrisy didn't escape me not. However, as I stood by and watched them knock down each and every tree in sight, I decided to head into town and ask about the building at courthouse. Ask the clerk, a friendly lady named Martha, who had helped me with problems regarding property taxes earlier, dialed up the permits on her computer. "Oh, that is new. Reynolds development," she said, pushing up her glasses. 36 luxury residences starting at $450,000. They already had an HOA. Very exclusive, highly high-end. My stomach twisted up at the words, HOA. "Do they have road access off the main road?" I asked, trying to sound indifferent. Martha tapped through a couple of screens. "It looks like they are still working that out. The only access point that seems to be there looks like," she scrunched up her face at the screen. "Well, that is odd. They don't seem to have direct road access in the current plans." I thanked Martha and left. An increasing feeling of unease in me. If they were not going to have direct road connection from the highway, how were they going to be importing construction machinery? The earth behind my land was rugged and hilly. There was really only one decent route in my road. The response came 3 days later. I was working from home when I heard the unmistakable sound of a diesel engine struggling up my private driveway. I looked out the window to see a gigantic cement mixer rumbling along, followed by 2 flatbeds loaded with lumber. They came with purpose, as if they were going to be there, like they had every right to be on my property. I put on my coat and ran outside, flailing my arms to flag down last truck in convoy. The driver reluctantly brought his truck to the curb, rolled down his window. "This is a private road," I stated firmly. "You can't have construction traffic come down here." The driver was a grizzled old man in his 50s. "Talk to the foreman," he replied. "I just drive where they tell me." "Where did you get permission to use this road?" I demanded. "HOA people said it was coming," he responded, already rolling up his window. "Had to keep going, buddy, had a timeline to keep." Before I could even utter a word, he changed gears and took off, leaving me standing amidst a cloud of dust and diesel smoke. I stood there stunned as the trucks pulled off toward the construction site, digging deep furrows into my well-juddy gravel went on. That evening, I rode down to look at the damage. The big rigs had torn up sections of the road, tossing gravel about and creating muddy ditches that would only deteriorate with rain. It would require hundreds to repair, work that I would have to pay for. The following morning, I got a letter in my mailbox. The envelope was printed with an embossed logo, Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association. I opened it in growing anger. "Dear neighbor," it began a too cheerful message. "We at Pinewood Estates anticipate becoming part of this wonderful community. In the spirit of neighborly cooperation, we would like to propose an agreement on the access road along your property. Because we construct our prestigious community. Temporary construction access would be greatly appreciated. We are sure we can achieve to an agreement that would be satisfactory to all concerned. It was signed by Craig Reynolds, HOA president and contractor. There was no acknowledgement that they had already used my road without permission. No mention of the damage that they had already done, simply the assumption that I would be willing to cooperate with their project, whatever that might have been. The letter concluded with a phone number I was to call to chat terms. I put the letter on my kitchen table and looked out the window at my deserted road. In the distance, I could hear the distant rumble of bulldozers. They weren't asking. They were telling, and they were telling me to just accept it. That was when I knew the peace I had created here was in danger. And it wasn't just the road. It was the principle. It was defying the very thing that I had come here to escape. I picked up the phone, but not to call the number on the letter. Instead, I called my friend Michael, who by sheer coincidence happened to be a real estate lawyer. This was not going to be a joint venture. This was going to be war. The invasion continued to advance with audacity. Every day a procession of trucks would come barreling down my street earlier and more frequently as time passed. What was once 3 or 4 trucks increased to 8, then 12. The single smooth gravel road surface of my deserted road worn down rapidly under the pounding of heavy machinery. I looked out my kitchen window and watched as dump trucks, cement mixers, and lumber flatbeds carved deeper ruts with each. The peaceful mornings which I had grown to love were now disrupted by the sound of trucks backing up and the screaming of construction men. The destruction was not limited to road conditions and noise. The construction workers who did this left behind a trail of garbage in their wake. Fast food wrappers, cigarette butts, discarded water bottles, and construction trash littering my property. At one point, I even discovered an empty porta potty shoved up against a tree at the end of my road. It took 3 phone calls to the rental company to have it removed. One day following a heavy rainstorm, I discovered that the ruts had been washed out, breaking up the drainage system on the road to draw water into some spots and onto my lawn. The cost of repair was piling up and my own patience was wearing thin, so I believed the time was ripe for a more forceful claim to ownership. I purchased an oversized, professionally produced sign and stood it in the doorway to my road. No building private land traffic. 6 LS will be PROSU TED. The sign couldn't be ignored, standing 6 feet high in big red lettering on white. The following morning, I stood at the end of the entrance to my road, coffee in my hand, ready to see what would occur. The first lorry appeared slowed briefly after the driver had read the sign and gone on to drive past me with scarcely a slowdown. The second driver didn't slow down. By mid-morning, I had taken count of 14 cars that had openly flouted my sign. I was photographing the license plates when a shiny black SUV drove up. The driver's side door opened and a man in his 40s emerged. He was wearing clean khakis, a blue button-down shirt with the cuffs of his shirt sleeves rolled above his wrists, and the smile on the man who was accustomed to getting his way. "Good morning," he lounged in parody good humor. "You've got to be my neighbor. I'm Craig Reynolds." He extended a hand as though we were meeting at a country club suburban Saturday bazaar, and not on the side of my property destruction. "Yeah, you're the writer. Construction traffic down my private road without permission." His smile didn't falter, but his eyes did harden. "There is some confusion about that. This road has an easement that has been established allowing access to the adjacent properties." "There is no easement," I told him outright. "I have owned this road for 7 years. It is deed to me, I keep it up, pay for it on it." Craig waved his hand away. "Historical precedent grants some rights of way. Our legal folks have looked into this a lot. Your legal folks are wrong," I told him, "and you need to stop your trucks from traveling on my road immediately." Craig's friendly front began to crack. "Listen, being stubborn about this does nobody any good. We are bringing in change and increasing property values to this town. Your land will be worth a great deal more money after Pinewood Estates has been constructed. I didn't ask for increased values. I told you I asked you for your trucks from my private driveway." His demeanor turned to one of almost repressed contempt. "We can make it official if that's what you want. Our lawyers can sue for an involuntary easement by necessity. That will keep this jammed in court for months, perhaps years. Then I tell you to get on with it," I said, "because those trucks are encroaching, and I am not going to let it happen." Craig's smile again came back, but was not in his eyes. "I had hoped we could be good neighbors. But if you're so determined to be obstinate, then we will take our way." He handed me his business card. "When you have had a chance to think, call me." As he drove off, I saw that he intentionally swerved off the gravel and onto my lawn and back onto the road with 2 deep tracks through my grass. The experience left me rattled, but more resolute than ever. I phoned a local surveyor, Jim Harkins, who had lived in the county for over 30 years. I needed to determine what I already knew. The road was entirely on my property, and there were no easements on file. Jim came over the next day in his mud-splattered pickup equipment in tow. He was a straight-talking type of professional who had dealt with his share of disputes over property. "A lot of development going way back there," he commented. As we walked down my street development, "I never agreed to provide support for my private street," I answered. Jim nodded seriously. "Let us get the facts straight, then you can decide what to do next." It took Jim most of the day to complete his work. As the sun began to set, he called me to review his discoveries. He spread maps across the hood of his truck and pointed to clearly marked boundaries. "This road is entirely within your property lines," he insisted. "The deed is clear. No public access agreements or rights of way, easements on record. It's as private as your living room." "And the HOA's historical precedent argument?" I asked. Jim shook his head. "No legal basis at all. Before you purchased this land, it was the old Milner farm. They used this as a private farm road. It never had been made public." I thanked Jim and paid him for his time, asking for official copies of his results. As he was dismantling his equipment, he stopped. "Word of advice," he said softly. "These developer types play hardball, document everything, take pictures, keep records. You might need them." 3 days later, a crier arrived at my door with an envelope. Inside was a formal cease and desist letter from Reynolds Development Group LLC that I was unlawfully obstructing access to community progress and halting legitimate construction activity. The letter forced me to remove my signage forthwith and halt all activity inhibiting access to the community access road. The audacity was incredible. They were demanding that I cease protecting my own property in their interests in behalf of a trespass at least. The letter concluded with a threat of a lawsuit. If I did not comply in 72 hours, I read the letter and forwarded it onto Michael and Jim's survey findings. His response was immediate. "Do not take anything away, do not sign anything. Keep taking everything down. I will report an incident of trespassing to the sheriff tomorrow." As news of the controversy began to leak out, I began noticing changes in the behavior of some of my neighbors. Gerald, who had always been welcoming, now hesitated to wave when we passed each other. At the local hardware store, conversation would sometimes trail off on my arrival, only to resume again in hushed tones after I had moved on. By on one evening, while making some of the repairs to my road, my mile-away neighbor Susan Miller stopped her vehicle right beside me. "I heard that you're being a thorn in the side of the Pinewood people," she said without greeting. "They are on my private drive," I clarified. "They are ruining property I have to pay to maintain." Susan frowned. "My sister is buying one of those homes. She says that the development will put all our properties up in value. Sometimes we have to take the greater good. The greater good is not stealing my property." I told her. She drove off shaking her head in dismay. It was clear the HOA was spinning the narrative in the neighborhood, demonizing me as the intransigent roadblock to progress and prosperity. But I had the truth. This wasn't about progress. It was about power and privilege, and I wasn't going to roll over. The struggle broke out beyond my driveway into the Byzantine terrain of county offices and legal papers. I discovered this when Martha from the county office phoned me one afternoon, her voice unusually tentative. "I wanted you to know," she said softly, as if dreading being caught. "Somebody at Reynolds Development mailed in papers yesterday asserting historical shared use of your street. They prepared what they claim is an old survey showing a shared right-of-way dating back to the 1960s. My hold on the phone tightened. "That's impossible. Jim Harkins just booked the entire property. There is no general use. There never has ever been. I know that Martha stated I have lived here 30 years, and I never saw them easement any easement on this property, but they officially filed it. So you now shall have to challenge it officially." The consequences were obvious. Even though their fraudulent claim, I would have to show the same investing time, money, and effort into arguing over something which would never in the first place be fraudulently claimed. Thanks for the update, I mentioned, grateful to her on all of our behalves for making that call. Martha was really going out on a limb, sharing this info with me before we had been formally informed. "Just doing my job," she replied. But both of us knew that was only half right. Oh, and incidentally, Craig Reynolds had golfed with Commissioner Wilson at the weekend. just to give you some background on the fellow you are working with." After I'd laid down, I phoned Michael straight away. He sat in grim silence while I worked my way through the situation, every now and then asking for explanation. When I'd done, he let out a deep breath. "This is a normal gambit," he said. "They are relying on you to capitulate, rather than resort to the bureaucratic war that most people do." "I am not most people," I replied. "I can tell you that," Michael stated, and I could feel the smile in his voice. "All right, here's what we're going to have to do. I will file a formal controversy on their claim and request copies of all of the documents they've filed. We are going to have to pull the initial deeds, 50 years or more back, to show no easement had been, since we must obtain statements from earlier owners, if at all possible." The fees were building up. The legal fees alone would be thousands, not to mention time I would have to take time off work to attend hearings and meetings. But the alternative to allowing this baseless claim go unchallenged was not an option. The second punch, 2 weeks later, I had applied for a permit to build an agricultural storage facility at the far end of my property, well distant from the contentious road. It should have had been standard approval. The zoning had allowed it. The dimensions were code, and all of my paperwork was correct. But week after week passed with no approval. When I did eventually call the zoning office to inquire why there was a delay, the clerk sounded regretful. "Your application has been put through special review," she explained. "Special review?" "Why?" I asked, although I had previously suspected the reply. "I am not allowed to comment on the details," she asserted, her voice hoping that she did know something and was not allowed to inform. "You will be written to informing you about the matter in due course." The letter came 3 days later, stating that my permit application was to undergo additional environmental impact assessment based on issues raised by community stakeholders for the protection of the watershed in subject development zones. It was bureaucratic malarkey. My little storage shed was not posing any environmental threat, and the local stakeholders were likewise apt Reynolds and his HOA buddies. They were using county contacts to intimidate me, so they might intimidate me into conceding the road issue. As if OnQ County likewise sent a stark warning about my unauthorized road posting, which alerted me that signs over a given size required permits in rural residential zones, a regulation of which I had never seen and suspected may have been applied selectively. Two could play at this game. I began going over the building permits for Pinewood Estates, looking for any inconsistencies or violations I could document. But they were too well scripted, too fastidious in their official records. Everything was okay, at least on the surface. One rainy Tuesday, while recording new damage to my road, from that morning's construction traffic, a now familiar black SUV drove by alongside me. Craig rolled down his window, huddling snugly dry, while I stood there getting wet. "This is costing you money, isn't it?" he said, his voice casual but the meaning obvious. "Lawyers' surveys, permit delays. It adds up." I said nothing, just kept on photographing the deep tire tracks, now mud-filled, water-filled trenches. "It doesn't have to be this way," Craig continued. "We can battle you at a price. Cooperating is easier. We could compensate you for road usage during construction, perhaps even include some upgrades to your property. Entrance, make it look nicer." The smugness in his tone when he said presentable made my jaw clench. He was looking at my modest home, my tastefully maintained but plain property, and seeing something less than his notion of luxury living. "My house isn't for sale, nor is my street," I told him firmly. "And neither is my principal." Craig's fake friendliness evaporated. "Look, everybody has a price. Name yours." Because this discussion is keeping 36 families in limbo who are ready to move to their dream homes. You are being selfish. Those families decided to invest in a complex with no legal entrance route. I explained that is not my problem to solve. Craig turned red-faced. "We have roots, legal roots, and we have influential individuals who endorse the values of progress." He put his SUV into drive. "Reflect on what matters to you. Take a serious consideration, because this fight will cost you more than you could ever have imagined." As he drove off, danger hung in the air between us, was as tangible as the rain dripping off my jacket. That night, I heard clattering out there. When I went outside to take a glance, I noticed that my mailbox had been knocked off the post and onto the ground some distance away. It was too battered to have had been wrecked by weather or a sloppy crash. Something hard, perhaps a baseball bat or tire iron, had smashed it. There were no witnesses, no indication of who had done it. But the timing immediately after my encounter with Craig seemed anything but coincidental. I replaced the new, stronger mailbox the following day. This time, I attached a small trail camera concealed in a birdhouse in the neighborhood. I'd had enough of being reactive. Starting today, I'd be prepared. Pressure grew still greater. My call to address a presentation at the upcoming county commissioners' meeting was inadvertently left off the agenda. My formal complaint to have construction equipment trespass on private property fell on deaf ears with the sheriff's department. Even my everyday mail arrived late or not at all. I began to get an idea of just how big it really was. This wasn't just some HOA president getting too big for his britches. This was a wealthy developer with a fat wallet and fatter buddies in the county government and business circles. They weren't just taking advantage of my street. They were taking the entire system down on me. But their biggest mistake was assuming that I would buckle under pressure. With each and every roadblock they put in front of me, my resolve only made me stronger. I had fled out of my house in this small town so that I might be rid of just this kind of bullying and domination. I would not be driven out of my home again. I was outnumbered and outfunded, but I was not penniless in my own right, and I was not without purpose. As I pored over the property maps once more one evening, following the borders of my land and the new Pinewood developments, I noticed something that had escaped me, something that made everything turn. The epiphany hit at 2:37 a.m. On a Thursday, I had spent hours upon hours poring over maps of property development plans and county records. My kitchen table covered in papers and my eyes tired from reading print. Sleep was a luxury I could hardly afford, as the battle for my road consumed more of my time and energy. I was preparing to call it a night when I saw something. A discrepancy between the HOA's development plans and the actual property lines recorded at the county office. Their building permits stated that Pinewood Estates had only one legally approved point of entry, and it wasn't my road. Their approved point of access would be over a small piece of land that would connect their development to the county highway. But as opposed to the rest of the development, this piece of land had also been named after a second owner, Elliot Garrison. I looked at the date on the plans they'd been submitted 8 months before, which meant Reynolds Development had meant to purchase this access parcel, but perhaps hadn't followed through transaction. I ran a quick check of recent land sales to confirm my suspicion. There was no history of Reynolds buying that property. Why on earth would they start building without first having won their legal point of entry? The answer became clear when I looked at the topography. The legal point of entry would be to build a steep, serpentine road up a tough hillside, a costly endeavor compared to the simple, already available flat road on my land. They had been cutting corners literally and figuratively. Rather than spending money on appropriate infrastructure for their luxury enclave, they had decided to encroach upon mine. I was hardly able to keep my composure as I grabbed my phone early in the morning. This was too urgent to wait till morning. I called Michael and apologized for waking him up. I found something which I had blurted out on the spur of the moment. The smoking gun. As I told Michael about my discovery, Michael became increasingly alert. This changes everything, he agreed. If they do not own their sanctioned access point, they have built an entire development with no legal in or out. Unless they can force me to grant them an easement across my property, I finished his sentence. Exactly. And now we understand why they've been so aggressive. It is not convenience, it is necessity without access via your land. Their entire project could be threatened. We sat for another hour, devising a plan that was bold in its simplicity. If the entry parcel was still in the hands of this Elliot Garrison, perhaps he would be glad to sell, not to Reynolds Development, but to me. As soon as the county offices opened that morning, I requested all the information regarding the parcel and owner Elliot Garrison. It just so happened to be a semi-retired real estate investor who had purchased the land years ago as a speculation investment. Most importantly, his address was registered in the next county. Just a 40-minute drive away, I decided to go visit him in person rather than risk a call that might be intercepted or a letter that might be read 3 hours later. I sat in Elliot Garrison's tiny home office explaining my situation. Elliot was a sharp-eyed man in his 60s with a no-nonsense demeanor that I really valued. He listened without hesitation as I read the facts now and then, nodding or raising an eyebrow at particularly vile details. When I finished with it, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me thoughtfully. So Reynolds never finalized the sale on my work, he stated bluntly. On county records, you still legally own it, I confirmed. Elliot nodded uncomfortably. That accounts for my experience. We had an in-principle agreement about 8 months ago. They paid a token earnest money and started asking for extensions and contingencies. His face darkened when I asked him the reasons for the delay. They became evasive. Then some 3 months ago, they tried to intimidate me into accepting half of the originally agreed price because of site preparation problems, reducing the parcel's value, than originally evaluated. Let me take an educated guess. I told Craig Reynolds made those negotiations. Elliot's eyebrows arched slightly. You know him pretty well. Unfortunately then, he does not like to be denied. When I held firm on our initial price, he threatened that the county would zone some of my other properties if I did not come into line with community development. The pattern was obvious, the same tactics, the same risks, the same sense of entitlement. So where are we now, I asked. In limbo, Elliot replied. They still can exercise the option to buy, but it is within 3 weeks. They've been stringing me along, most likely hoping I would crack under pressure or financial stress. I took a deep breath. What if I agreed to buy it myself, instead at the original full price you originally negotiated with them? Elliot stared at me unflinchingly. That would certainly cure my dilemma. Though, are you absolutely certain that you want to do this? Reynolds won't be pleased, I am counting on that. I said throughout the hour we haggled terms. The package did not come cheaply. 5 acres of roadside frontage land never does, but I had money to burn, and it was as good as it sounded. By the time we were done meeting, we had a handshake agreement with formal documents to come. I was resigning. Elliot outstretched his hand. For what it's worth, he said, I believe you're doing the right thing. These developers stroll in, change the character of an area, then off to the next scheme. Someone should remind them that rules still exist. I shook his hand tightly. That is exactly what I intend to do. The next 2 weeks were a blur of activity. I got financing signed papers and spoke with land use professionals about what I could legally do with my property to be purchased. Michael went over every document painstakingly, ensuring there were no loopholes or weaknesses that Reynolds would be able to exploit in this transaction. I demonstrated an outward display of defeated resignation. When construction vehicles still used my road, I no longer withstood them. When Craig smiled smugly at me from behind his SUV, I turned away as if shattered. Let them think they had won. The shock would only make my countermove stronger. The day the deed was transferred to my name, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time in months, I slept well, untroubled by worry or anger. The building was mine. The point of entry was mine, and above all, control of the situation was now mine. I had a final consultation lined up this time with Veronica Chen, a land use attorney who was also a specialist in building law and property rights. Her office was in the city, a deliberate effort to ensure no one from my county would catch us meeting. Veronica was direct and to the point. You do have some options, she said, after reviewing my documents. You could build a barrier that excludes entry, install a gate with restricted codes of entry, or simply place obvious signs excluding entry. Legally, you do have the right to control access to your property in any way allowed by zoning regulations. What would be most warranted if placed on trial, I asked. She paused to consider it an overall strategy. Physical barriers that are code compliant, proper. Signage announcing it, private property and boundaries documented. The key is ensuring whatever you're doing is by the books, permits filed, inspected, approved, no loopholes. It was only the plan I had been looking forward to. Not a quick act of retribution, but a thoughtful legal regaining of something that was rightfully mine. I departed from her office with a firm game plan and a sense of purpose. Now it was only a question of executing and timing. Implementation day arrived exactly 7 days after I had gained title to the access parcel. I spent the intervening week strategically planning acquiring required permits and working with contractors who bore no connection to Reynolds or his associates. Everything was to occur at the same time, maximum effect with minimum warning. At precisely 6 a.m. on the sunny Tuesday morning, 3 different work crews arrived at the access parcel. One began putting in fence posts along the property edge. Another began removing enormous decorative beach rocks from a flatbed truck. The third began installing where to place in a row of adult evergreen trees. Arriving later that morning, I had chosen the time deliberately early enough so the majority of the Pinewood Estates construction team would not yet have arrived, but late enough so we were not in violation of any noise ordinances. By the time the initial construction equipment began arriving at 7:30 a.m., the foundation shape of my barrier was already forming. The fence was my top priority, an 8-foot-tall ornamental iron barrier with brick pillars spaced 20 feet apart. It was lovely, costly, and most importantly, fully in accordance with all local regulations. I had the permits prominently posted on the worksite, along with property boundary markers, clearly indicating that every inch of the construction was occurring on land. I legally owned. The trucks began lining up on the edge of the property, drivers leaving to gaze at the fast accumulating barrier in wonder. A foreman approached as I watched the fence being installed. "What is wrong here?" he demanded. "We must get through." I whipped out my business card. "This is private property," I told him calmly. "If you have concerns regarding access to the site, please contact your project manager. I am confident that they will make some alternative arrangements." Alternative arrangements? There are no alternative arrangements. "This is the only way," and his face was wreathing with frustration. "That is a planning oversight which had to be resolved before the groundbreaking of 36 houses." I responded calmly, "By 900 a.m. Word had leaked out. More trucks had arrived now in a line that stretched far back to the highway. Workers crowded in clusters, phoning on their phones, and more anxious about their day's gain. I sympathized with them. They were not my rival in this battle. They were merely out earning a living's value. But I was reminded that blame for their problem was with Reynolds' development and not mine. At 9:37 a.m., the black SUV I had seen earlier came back barreling down the street, blowing the horn as it was on its way. Craig screeched to a halt and got out of his vehicle. His face twisted into rage. "What in the devil do you think you're doing?" he roared as he walked over to me. I kept my cool, repairing my property. "It is going to be very pretty when it is finished." "Your property?" Craig sputtered. "This is the entrance to Pinewood Estates." "In fact," I told him, "this is the entrance to nowhere right now, and it's mine. I just purchased it from Elliott Garrison. The deed is filed in the county office if you'd like to verify." Craig reddened first, then paled, as the implications settled in. "That is impossible. We had made a business arrangement with Garrison." "You had a choice that you never used," I straightened him out, "and now the property belongs to me." For a brief moment, I thought he actually might attempt to punch me. His fists were clenched, and a vein pulsed visibly at his temple. Instead, he pulled out his phone and strode away, already dialing while driving back to his SUV. By lunchtime, the fence was half complete. The boulders were already in place along property lines, and the initial of the evergreen trees were being planted. I had picked massive Norway spruces already 12 feet high and large enough to block sight as well as access. In a few years' time, they would become an impassable natural barrier. At various times of the day, different officials made their calls. A building inspector who examined all my permits were current. A sheriff's deputy who was powerless because no law was being violated. And finally, at long last, a man in a fancy suit who presented himself as Stanley Wright, lawyer for Reynolds Development. Stanley took a more combative,